Hey everybody, CVH here, and today we're going to be doing a different kind of video for Elder Scrolls Legends besides the normal strategy content for the game. What I wanted to do is just take a bit of time and talk about some potential changes I'd like to maybe see looked at in the game. I don't really have any strong complaints right now, but I haven't done a video like this in a long time where I discuss potential nerfs to cards, and this won't just be focused on nerfs, just some things that I think the game could benefit from moving forward. I haven't really talked about the game in this sort of direction in a video in a long time, like I mentioned. Even though we've had some card changes in the past, I just sort of covered them and my thoughts on them after the fact. But I thought I'd take this amount of time and theory craft with you guys, maybe start a conversation. So let me know in the comments what you guys think about these ideas. I'm going to touch a little bit on the cards, a little bit on the gameplay, and even some outside of the game stuff. So without further ado, let's jump right in onto some things that Elder Scrolls Legends could use in the future. First and foremost, I'm just going to put it out there that I'm really looking forward, as I'm sure many of you are, to official tournaments. I'm sure Bethesda and Direwolf Digital have plans to support official tournaments for the game. We've seen some third-party organizers already put in some work to develop some fun tournaments, and they've done really good jobs of that. But I think we're all looking forward to officially supported tournaments happening that are, widely publicized. You get some esport action going on, some nice production value on Twitch and all that stuff. So the suggestions I'm going to be giving, both in regards to the meta and the game itself, are sort of going to go hand in hand with that, because of course I'd like to play competitively, as I'm sure many of you out there would. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about some card changes that I think might help the meta long term. One of the elephants in the room, there's several actually. I'm not talking about Supreme Atromancer. I will actually touch on that card in a bit. But the first thing I want to talk about is Ramp Scout. Now Ramp Scout, back before Histgrove was nerfed to trigger at the start of your turn, saw a lot of people complaining about it, and that sort of come back in recent weeks, because basically Heroes of Skyrim gave the deck a lot of new tools, and it is just without a doubt the strongest slower deck currently in the game. I don't think anyone would dispute that fact. But moving forward, it might sort of dominate the late game and not let other non-purple using control decks compete really with it at all. There are definitely decks that do well against Ramp Scout. The card I just mentioned, Supreme Atromancer, is incredibly powerful against it, but I think the power level of Ramp Scout might need to be toned down somewhat. And when it comes to doing that, there are two cards that stick out in my mind personally that would accomplish that goal if they were nerfed slightly. And those cards are Woodland Lookout and Soul Tear. They do very different things, but I've heard arguments from multiple people about each of them being potentially the most powerful card in the deck, or at least the most powerful card that Heroes of Skyrim gave Ramp Scout. Woodland Lookout basically gave the deck, in addition to all the dragons you would play in the deck already, like Nogleaf, Shearpoint Dragon, and of course Spine of Elder's Blood, Odahviing, Paarthurnax. Since you're already going to be wanting to play all of those dragons, Woodland Lookout is sort of twofold. You get the most consistent heal option possible. You don't have to run Snaketooth Necklace or Moonlight Werebat or Night Shadow anymore. And it also gives you a 3-drop 3/4 body. So this card has single-handedly helped people trade early in the game against aggro alongside Dark Guardian, and it's also given the deck a very succinct way to add healing to the deck without having to run a very narrow card like the Werebat or Snaketooth Necklace. The card is immensely powerful, and I've seen it as a 3-of in basically every single successful ramp deck that I've seen. Soul Tear is basically on the opposite end of the spectrum, whereas the Woodland Lookout is primarily helpful against aggressive decks, and it's given Ramp Scout a lot more game against them. Soul Tear is basically the reason I think that it's sort of putting a monopoly on the late game. Soul Tear is possibly the strongest resource any deck has currently in the late game, and a lot of that's due to the whole unique legendary thing. In a 50-card deck, you can only run one of certain cards like Red Brahmin and Paarthurnax, and Soul Tear essentially lets you run up to 4 copies of them if you can draw the Soul Tears. Turns your discard pile into a resource, and I think that's a lot of the reason people are upset with the deck, is because the ramp in conjunction with the powerful 1-ups in Scout and having access to the 3 Soul Tears is making for a bit of a frustrating time against Ramp Scout if the game goes any sort of late. So personally, I think a nerf needs to happen to one of these two cards. You could make the argument for Woodland Lookout. It's definitely more powerful than a card like Blades Lookout or any of the other 3-drops that were released to really push dragons. But the fact that it's more powerful is probably the reason we're actually seeing a dragon package in Scout, and we haven't really seen dragon decks in any other combinations of colors take off at all. So I kind of like, from a flavor standpoint, Woodland Lookout being able to push dragons to be competitive. Now, Soul Tear, on the other hand, I think there are numerous ways they could potentially nerf it. You could just up it to a 3 cost. That said, I don't think it makes it much worse at all. I think Solitaire is still basically the same power level as it is because the decks that use Solitaire in the late game will have a lot of excess Magicka moving into the turns where it's really powerful. So while I think that it could very well have been made a 3 Magicka card, and I'm not really sure why it's so low cost, I don't really think that would actually nerf the card too much. What I think might work is a combination of moving it to 3 Magicka and also removing the buff somewhat. You could make it +1/+1 on level 2 and +2/+2 on level 2. Because to be honest, I think if it were a 3 Magicka action that wasn't even a shout, so it didn't have any additional benefits on level 2 and level 3, I'm pretty sure I'd still be playing 3 copies in a lot of the same decks that I'm playing 3 copies in currently. Now, I should mention one other solution to the problem of Solitaire that we're discussing that many people have suggested is to limit it by level for the first copy and the second copy. First time you play Solitaire, you wouldn't be able to get back anything that cost 4 Magicka or above. You'd have to get something back that was level 3 or less. Maybe the second time you play Solitaire, you can get something back that costs 6 or less. I think this significantly puts a stop to the shenanigans of Solitaire. I really like the versatility of Solitaire, however, and I don't like being forced to level it up or draw 3 to get a powerful card back. I just think at the moment it's a little bit too easy to fit in, and maybe a little bit too many upsides for level 2 and level 3. I don't really know what the right way to go about it is, but I do think the Ramp Scout problem is probably going to be less of a problem if they nerf Solitaire somewhat. So back to Supreme Atromancer, we mentioned that card, but we didn't really talk about intelligence in general. I almost did a video just on this topic, but everyone seems to think that intelligence, or blue, is overpowered right now. And by everyone, I mean like a vocal minority. However, even if you don't think intelligence is overpowered, chances are you think it's the most powerful attribute right now. And I can back that up with some empirical data. All you gotta do is check the description. I'll be linking Arkham Warlock's recent article. He did a survey on Reddit and linked it in several streams such as mine to get a lot of responses. He got between 600 and 700 responses to the survey, and one of the questions was, which color do you think is the most powerful right now? And blue won by a landslide, actually. It got more than 50% of the votes, compared to, you know, there's 4 other colors plus the neutral attribute as well. But yeah, intelligence was far and away the winner. It seems like even if people don't think it's overpowered, they definitely think intelligence is just the strongest color currently. And that could be due to a number of reasons. I don't really think each individual card is, I don't really think any individual card in blue is really pushed. I think Supreme Atromancer, for an example, is really powerful, possibly just seeing as much play as it does, though, because it's really the only truly good proactive finisher in the game currently. There's a lot of late game options for slower decks, but if you're a mid-range deck trying to close out the game, you have Bone Colossus and Supreme Atromancer and Tazcad. And the difference is Bone Colossus can only be played in Sorcerer, and is definitely weaker than Atromancer, and the other cards that are proactive are just unique legendary. So Atromancer is filling a very important role, and that's a lot of the reason I don't really want to see it nerfed. I think it does fill an important role to be able to let those mid-range decks beat those slow decks that don't have sweepers. It's one of the best counters to Ram Scout decks after all, and like I just mentioned, that's also one of the most prominent decks in the metagame currently. But if we look at other cards, we have Lightning Bolt, that's the 3 of in almost every single blue deck, Shrieking Harpy, Wardcrafter, sort of the same deal, Daggerfall Mage. Yeah, all these cards are just incredibly powerful, even Ice Storm for any sort of slower blue deck. A lot of these are just staple in the color. And I think, while in a vacuum, none of them are really too powered by themselves. I think a lot of it's because so many different cards were nerfed over the past 10 or 12 months since I've been playing the game since last July in 2016. Many other cards that made blue seem more balanced have been nerfed. For example, Agility, numerous times, saw tons of nerfs. House Kinsman, Moonlight Werebat, Tazcad, Murkwater Savage, Red saw some nerfs, Burn and Pillage being probably the most notable one. Some blue cards were nerfed too, like Dark Rift and Brilliant Experiment, but overall I think it was sort of a matter of everything else getting weaker and blue seeming overpowered by default. I don't really think they released something too crazy for it, although I will say that it was interesting that they gave blue Thief of Dreams and Encano in Heroes of Skyrim after it was already pretty much known to be at the top of the pinnacle of the attributes currently. But what could you really do about the blue problem here? I have a couple ideas. I think a lot of it is just going to have to be toning down one of these cards a bit more. You could look at a number of them. I think cards like Lightning Bolt, Supreme Atromancer, while they might be the most powerful currently, they do fill specific roles. What they did before was nerf Shrieking Harpy from a 2/2 to a 2/1, and I think a nerf along these lines could be the thing that brings blue back down to a realistic power level. Well, I look at Shrieking Harpy specifically because besides a card like Lightning Bolt, I think Shrieking Harpy finds its way into the most intelligence decks. I don't really have stats to back this up off the top of my head, but all aggro decks that run blue play Shrieking Harpy, all mid-range decks that run blue play Shrieking Harpy, and all control decks that run blue play Shrieking Harpy, which is pretty shocking considering that it did already go through a nerf from 2-2 to 2-1. I think the only place to go from there is to either make it a 3-cost or make it a 1-1. I don't have high hopes for the playability of the card if either of those things happen, but I think maybe that's exactly the kind of thing that needs to happen if we're to rein in blue a little bit without it losing its identity. Shrieking Harpy is just really ubiquitous, obviously a very swingy prophecy, and people who aren't a huge fan of the prophecy mechanic probably wouldn't suffer too much to see Shrieking Harpy take a little bit more of a nerf, but it would significantly impact the power level of the attribute simply because, well, I don't think the nerf would kill any deck. You can take Shrieking Harpy out of any deck, it still probably functions. It is a card that slots itself into every single blue deck, so you'd automatically want to play blue a little bit less since you're almost definitely playing blue in part because of a card as good as Shrieking Harpy no matter what style of deck you're playing. So if we're trying to make blue a little bit less of an automatic inclusion in control decks and mid-range decks and aggro decks, maybe a card like Shrieking Harpy is the place to look. Again, I'd love to hear your opinions. If you were going to nerf intelligence, what would you maybe start looking at? Again, personally, I don't think it's going to be Atromancer or Lightning Bolt, but maybe you look at a card like that, maybe you look at a card like Harpy or Wardcrafter. Love to hear your thoughts on those as well. So the last major thing I want to discuss in today's video isn't a card change at all, it's the Ring of Magicka, and I have mentioned this a few times on stream and in different videos. You might have heard me talk about it before. The Ring of Magicka has always been, well, it used to be the elixir of Magicka, but even back then, it was a source of much debate because it did the same thing, it was just a support card instead of a thing that was on the board that you couldn't really interact with. I get a lot of questions from new players, especially those coming from Hearthstone. Isn't having 3 coins overpowered? And I have to explain, it's not really 3 coins. They aren't cards that you can benefit a card like Crystal Tower Crafter with. They're not actually actions or spells from your hand. And you're also not getting an additional card when you start the game when you go second. So it does kind of balance itself out in that respect. However, it does feel incredibly bad to lose to the Ring of Magicka, especially due to the prevalence of all these mid-range decks currently. And due to that, even if you're not playing a mid-range deck, you likely want to start with the Ring just because of how powerful a curve deck is. And by a curve deck, I mean an aggro or mid-range deck that just wants to start playing things on curve and hitting you with them. Just nature of how powerful those decks are if they get the Ring and can play first for the first few turns of the game means if you're a control deck, you still want to get the Ring, mostly just so your opponent doesn't have the Ring and you can start responding to things in the early game easier. Over the course of a very long game, if you don't have the Ring, you'll be playing before your opponent most of the time. But that said, the most important turns of the game are the very early turns. I've definitely heard a lot of people say they think it should only be 2 charges. I do remember Direwolf Digital, one of the devs from Direwolf Digital at least, said it was tested at 2 charges, I think, and wasn't necessarily as powerful as they wanted. Apparently going first was significantly favored, at least to the point where they made it 3. That said, they could do something like Hearthstone and give it only 1 charge, and then the second player draws a card at the start. Well, they start with 1 more card at the beginning of the game, but in Hearthstone, you just always want to go first. It's sort of the same situation except backwards, and I don't think that's really a solution. That's just sort of shifting the focus of what we're mad at when we start a game. The ideal is to make it a little bit more balanced. So I heard a great suggestion a long time ago. This is what you might have heard me mention, but I thought I'd mention it in this video as well, since it's a dedicated video talking about things we could see changed in Legends. And the change that I heard was giving the Ring a cooldown of 1 turn. So what this means is if you use the Ring of Magicka to gain 1 additional max Magicka for the turn, 1 additional Magicka for the turn, not max Magicka, just Magicka, you use the Ring, get that additional Magicka. The following turn, you can't use the Ring. You might still have 2 charges left. Assuming the Ring still has 3 charges, you might still have the 2 left, but you won't be able to use 1 on the following turn. The turn after that, you're good to go. So, for example, on turn 1, I could ring out a Windkeep Spell Sword, but I couldn't immediately follow that up on turn 2 with a Young Mammoth. On turn 3, I could use the Ring, or I could not use the Ring. It's up to me. On turn 4, if I hadn't used the Ring on turn 3, I could use it. Basically like that. In my opinion, a lot of the problematic games involving the Ring of Magicka aren't necessarily even when all the charges of the Ring are used. A lot of them are when your opponent just gets that much farther ahead than you because they use them in succession, because it really smooths out the curve. If there's anything early to play at all, it just sort of fixes the Magicka curve, no matter what's really in your hand. So for example, if I'm going second and I start with a 2-cost card and a 3-cost card, I know that I can ring out my 2-cost and then I'll definitely have a play I can make the following turn by just using the ring on turn 2 on my 3-cost card. And that's incredibly, incredibly powerful. Combinations of cards like Goblin Skulk and Brotherhood Slayer, Windkeep Spellsword and Young Mammoth, Goblin Skulk and or Mournhole Trader and Brotherhood Slayer, for example. So many different combinations of 2 and 3 costs, when used with the ring to make sure you can play them before your opponent starts developing, are just really hard to beat currently, and I think giving it a cooldown will fix that a lot. So I can ring out my 2-drop, but it won't necessarily smooth out my curve perfectly. If I don't have another 2-drop, I might be skipping turn 2, so it makes you able to not necessarily keep as greedy of a hand. You can't just fix your curve like that. So maybe a lot of players, and given the 2 and 3-drop, wouldn't ring out the 2-drop. They would just save the ring for a later turn, maybe ring out the 3-drop the following turn and see what happens after that. But it does provide some different options for nerfing the ring that aren't necessarily nerfing the amount of charges. Because, if you ring a 2-drop and then ring a 3-drop, you might not even need the 3rd charge for a few turns. It's that quick succession of utilizing that extra magicka that I think is causing a lot of, I don't really want to say unfun, but a little bit uninteractive games, because a lot of the reason people leave Hearthstone is because curve decks are king, and the Ring of Magicka fixes your curve in a way to where a lot of games do seem decided by the first few turns. So maybe in the future we see a change like that to the ring. I don't know, we're already in full release. This is something that I think it's a really big change that I'm sort of advocating for, and they definitely probably could have tested it like this before the release of the game. Maybe they found it to not work. I'd love to hear some thoughts on it from the dev team. It's something that I think I would want to test personally. But if they don't do something like this, I would understand it. However, in the same vein as the tournaments we discussed earlier, I think something should be done with the Ring of Magicka for tournaments. And this is a problem I had in Hearthstone as well. It's fixed in IRL card games. You're playing a game in person. If you lose a game, you get to choose whether you go first or go second the following game. That's not a thing in this game currently. So if I'm playing a best-of-5 match with my opponent, there is a chance, it's a low chance, but there's a chance that I just never get the Ring of Magicka. And if we're playing matchups where the ring matters, as in most of them currently, that's going to feel really, really bad to me. So maybe you can alternate it, but I think maybe you just make it in a tournament format. You have a mode dedicated to it where the loser in the first game of the match gets to choose in game 2 whether they go first or second. Definitely something we've seen in tons of card games up to this point, but not really implemented in an online game yet. I would love to see something like that happen. Obviously kind of irrelevant for the latter since it's all best of ones, but if we're talking about tournaments, if the ring doesn't get changed in any way, I would at least like the players to have a bit more control over whether or not they get the ring. So that's pretty much it for my thoughts. Just wanted to ramble a little bit about some different aspects of Legends. Overall, I'm incredibly happy with the state of the game at the moment. I've loved playing it, but I've loved playing it for the last year straight, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. I don't want this to be perceived as any sort of rant or complaint video about things like the ring or specific cards. Honestly, if nothing gets nerfed and the ring doesn't get changed, I'll still be in love with the game. These are just potential changes since, why not discuss some ways Elder Scrolls Legends could change in the future? And, of course, to start the conversation, so feel free to let me know what you think about any of these points, and anything that you think I might have skipped or glossed over in the comments. Let me know what you'd like to see happen in Elder Scrolls Legends. I'm sure Bethesda and Direwolf Digital are keeping a keen ear to what the community says and writes in these comment sections as well. And of course, if you've liked the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more Legends content. Check out my stream in the description, and I'll see you guys next time.